I found out I'd been cast as the male lead in the Ashwood Harbor Christmas play by reading a bulletin board taped crooked to the lobby wall of the Grange Playhouse. It was next to a flyer for a fish fry that had already happened in October. My name was under the words Henry Abbott, lead. Under Henry Abbott, it said, in smaller letters somebody had clearly enjoyed typing, opposite Roberta Lindqvist as Clara Abbott. There was a laugh already forming in the lobby before I'd even finished reading it. I am Silas Kane, 33 years old, and I fix boat motors and lake cabin furnaces for a living. That means I spend my winters elbow deep in things nobody thinks about until they break. I had never acted in anything in my life, not even the 8th grade Thanksgiving pageant, where I'd been given the role of turkey number 2 and had refused the antlers on principle. My Aunt Dot ran props for the Grange Playhouse and had signed me up for just crew, Silas, I promise. That was how I'd ended up on a cast list I never auditioned for, across from a woman I'd said maybe 9 words to in 3 years of living 2 streets over from the theater. Dale Ferris, who sat on the board and had never once in his life resisted an opportunity to be the funniest man in a room that hadn't asked him to be, was standing by the coffee urn grinning like he'd invented electricity. Thought it'd be good for a laugh, he said, to nobody and everybody. Silas Kane, leading man. Bobby Lindqvist, leading lady. Somebody's got to play the romance, and God knows Bobby's due. 12 years of innkeeper's wives. Might as well let her try the real thing once. The room laughed. Not cruelly, exactly. Small towns don't usually laugh cruelly. They laugh the way people laugh at a mailbox that's fallen over in a storm, at something absurd that isn't really anyone's fault. But it was still a laugh at her, dressed up as a laugh at me, and I watched Roberta Lindqvist's face while it happened. She was standing near the costume rack with a tape measure looped around her neck like a stole, 40-ish. I'd learn later she was 47. Silver was already coming in at her temples in a way she clearly hadn't bothered, disguising, sharp-boned, unhurried. She didn't flinch. She just looked at the bulletin board like she was reading a grocery receipt for items she hadn't bought, then looked at Dale with an expression that had absolutely nothing to give him. Innkeeper's wife again would have been fine. Dale, she said, mild as milk. You didn't have to work this hard to embarrass both of us. That got a bigger laugh than his joke had, and I noticed something small happen in her jaw when it did. Not pleasure, not quite, but the particular relief of a woman who'd learned that if she got there first, nobody else could land the blow. I heard something underneath it, too. The practiced speed of her line, loaded before Dale had even finished his sentence. You don't get that fast at deflecting a thing unless you've been hit by it before, more than once, in more than one room. I didn't laugh at all. I want to be clear that I wasn't offended on principle or nursing some noble streak that morning. I was mostly just tired. Tired in the specific way a man gets 14 months after his fiancée moves to Chicago for a marketing job neither of us had ever discussed her wanting. No fight, no other man, just Renee sitting on the edge of our bed one Tuesday saying she'd been offered something she couldn't turn down. Not bitter, just tired, in the way a dock piling gets tired, still standing, just weathered smooth. I'd stopped expecting things to be about me a while back, which left plenty of room to notice when they were about somebody else. What I hadn't told anybody, not even Ray, was the specific shape the tiredness took most nights. It was mostly just the coat hook by the door, still holding Renee's old barn jacket for 3 months after she'd asked me to just donate it, please, and me saying I would and then not doing it. Taking it down felt like admitting the house had gone back to being just a house. It was making coffee for 2 out of habit, pouring the second cup down the sink every morning like a small, private funeral. I'd gotten good at filling that quiet with work, a stripped carburetor here, a furnace intake there. Engines, unlike people, told you exactly what was wrong with them, and never once decided, politely, over eggs, that they wanted a different life than the one you'd built together. I didn't resent Renee for leaving. There was no villain to blame, just a woman who wanted Chicago more than she wanted me. That had left me standing in my own kitchen at 33 with a stranger's amount of time on my hands and nowhere honest to put it. And what I noticed, watching Bobby Lindqvist absorb a joke at her own expense with her spine perfectly straight, was that nobody in that lobby had ever once asked whether she wanted the joke to be true. So I went home and read the script front to back 4 times that night, because the Kane family has never done anything halfway once we've decided to do it at all. By the time first rehearsal rolled around the following Tuesday, I had every line of Henry Abbott memorized, timed to his cues, Time to Clara's cues, too, because I'd read her half so many times I could have fed Bobby her own lines back if she'd frozen. I didn't tell anybody I'd done it. I just showed up to the Grange Playhouse, script-free. The stage manager, a nervous, kind woman named Priya, who directed the actors while everyone politely pretended Gerald Pruitt was the one directing, called Top of Scene 2, Silas, whenever you're ready. I said Henry Abbott's first line clean, no stumble, no script in my hand. The room went quiet in a way that was different from Dale's laugh. Bobby line-cuvist, standing at her mark with a pincushion strapped to her wrist on a worn leather band, looked at me the way you look at a motor that's just turned over on the first try after you were sure it wouldn't. "You memorized it," she said. Not a question. An accusation, almost. "I memorized it," I agreed. "All of it. All of Henry. Most of Clara, if you ever want a night off." Somebody near the back, Dale, actually, which was its own kind of justice, let out a short laugh, and this time it wasn't at anybody. Bobby's expression did something complicated, guarded, and surprised at once, like she'd caught herself starting to feel something before she'd checked it was safe to. "Well," she said, dry as a church basement, "I suppose we'd better rehearse, since you've clearly decided this is a real play." "It was always real," I said. "Some of us just found out later." She held my gaze a second longer than the line required. Then she turned to her mark and delivered Clara Abbott's first line like she'd been waiting a decade for someone to give her a reason to say it like she meant it. Ashwood Harbor is the kind of town where everyone knows everyone's weather before they know their name. By the following morning half, the marina had heard that Silas Kane had memorized an entire Christmas play overnight out of spite, which wasn't quite true, though I didn't correct it. My buddy Ray, who crewed with me on the marina's summer charter boat, laughed so hard when I told him I was playing a romantic lead that he had to sit down on a bucket. "You," Ray said, wiping his eyes, "who once described a woman's perfume as like somebody spilled a candle, are playing a man who recites poetry to a widow in Act 2. It's not poetry. It's a letter. Some of it rhymes." Ray put his head in his hands like I'd told him I was taking up interpretive dance, and I let him have his laugh. Underneath the ribbing, I could tell he was glad to see me doing something that wasn't just fixing other people's motors and going home to a quiet house that still had a woman's coat hook by the door I hadn't taken down. That was the other thing nobody in Ashwood Harbor said out loud, though everyone knew it. That I'd been engaged. That Renee Falk and I had picked out rings and a hall and a date. And that 14 months ago, she'd taken a marketing job with a firm in Chicago. She'd told me plainly, sitting on the edge of our bed, no tears on her part, a few on mine. I'd driven her to the airport myself. There was no villain in it anywhere, just two people who wanted different sizes of life, and a whole town that treated me afterward the way you treat a man who survived something without quite being wounded by it. Careful, a little too gentle, waiting for a crack that never showed because there wasn't one to find. Not bitter, just tired. The Grange Playhouse in November is not a warm building. It was built in 1961 as an actual Grange Hall, and the ancient forced air furnace in the basement, which the whole cast had taken to calling Gerald, because the furnace, like the actual Gerald Pruitt, took credit for warmth it didn't generate and mostly just clanked, had two settings, off, and a wounded shriek that suggested it was actively dying. Somebody had to fix it before opening night, or we'd be performing to an audience in parkas. I fix things. So on the second week of rehearsals, while the rest of the cast ran Act 2 upstairs, I went down into the crawl space under the stage with a headlamp and a socket set. I found Bobby line-cuvist already down there ahead of me, on her knees in front of the furnace with a flashlight in her teeth and a look on her face that said she'd been fighting this particular war alone for longer than one evening. "You don't have to do this," she said around the flashlight. "Neither do you," I said. And yet, she took the flashlight out of her mouth. "Somebody has to keep this building from turning into a meat locker, and it's not going to be Gerald Pruitt." "You run this whole place," I said. It wasn't a question either. I'd been paying attention for 2 weeks. "Not just costumes." She went still in the particular way people go still when you've said the true thing they've spent years arranging for nobody to say out loud. "I keep the costume shop," she said carefully. "Gerald directs. Gerald hasn't blocked a scene in 10 years. You block every scene. Then tell Priya to tell Gerald it was his idea, and Gerald believes it." She was quiet for a second. Then, without looking up from the furnace's guts, she said, "It's easier this way." "Easier isn't the same as right." "No," she agreed. "But easier keeps the lights on, And I don't have to stand at that podium being thanked for something that'll get taken away from me the second somebody with a title decides they want it back. She said it flat, like a fact she'd filed away years ago, not like a wound. That was, I'd learn, mostly how Bobby Lindkuvist talked about the things that actually hurt her. Flat, filed, finished, so nobody could pick it back up and use it on her twice. I handed her a socket wrench instead of an answer, because I didn't yet know her well enough to argue with her about her own life. We spent the next hour trading tools in the cramped dark under the stage while Gerald, the furnace, hissed at us both like it resented the attention. The crawl space smelled like dust and scorched metal and, faintly, the mothball sweetness that had soaked into every costume rack above our heads for 40 years. Bobby worked with the quick, economical movements of somebody who'd fixed 100 small broken things because nobody else was going to. She held the headlamp steady for me without being asked, angling it exactly where my hands were before I'd finished reaching. "Somebody should thank you for that," I said. "Somebody should do a lot of things," she said, and handed me the next socket before I'd asked for it, which was its own kind of answer. We didn't fix it that night. We got it running long enough to limp through December, is all patched instead of cured, the exhaust valve rattling every time it cycled on, a sound the whole cast came to recognize and complain about, and eventually find almost comforting, the way you get used to a house creaking. But we went back down there 3 more times before the run closed, always on some pretext. A hissing joint, a pilot light that wouldn't hold, a smell Bobby swore was gas, and I swore was just 40 years of dust burning off a coil. Each time it took a little longer than the actual repair required. The crawl space was cramped enough that we had to work close, shoulders nearly touching, her handing me sockets before I asked, and me passing her the flashlight, the second her hands were full, a wordless choreography neither of us commented on. I found myself, on the 3rd trip, bringing an actual toolbox instead of borrowing whatever the Grange had lying around. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Bobby Lindkuvist noticed everything, cataloged it, filed it away behind that flat, unreadable face she wore for the rest of the world. "You bought a toolbox," she said, watching me set it down like evidence in a trial. "Maybe I like fixing furnaces." "Nobody likes fixing furnaces, Silas. People tolerate it because the alternative is worse." She crouched back down next to Gerald's rattling guts, and in the headlamp light, I watched the corner of her mouth do something it hadn't done at the bulletin board 3 weeks earlier. "But I suppose I don't mind the company, whatever the pretext," I decided, crouched in 40-year-old dust with a woman who measured her own affection out in half sentences, that I could live a long time on a concession that small. The real work happened backstage, among the costume racks, which is where Bobby spent most of every rehearsal that didn't require her on stage, hemming, pressing, muttering at a sequined vest that had been donated by someone's late aunt and smelled, unmistakably, of 1987. I started coming back there instead of sitting in the house with the rest of the cast, ostensibly to run lines, actually because it was the only part of the building that felt like it had a person living in it rather than a play merely passing through. "You don't have to babysit me," she said the first night I dragged a folding chair back among the racks. "I'm not babysitting. I like hearing your lines better than mine." She didn't answer that, but she didn't tell me to leave either, which from Bobby Lindkuvist counted as an invitation. We fell into it without deciding to. I'd read Henry's lines at her. She'd throw Clara's back without looking up from the needle. Somewhere in the 3rd week, she started making cocoa on a hot plate she kept illegally plugged in behind the costume rack against every fire code Gerald Pruitt had ever pretended to enforce, and pouring it into 2 mugs that didn't match anything, including each other. Mine had a faded anchor on it and a chip on the handle from my father's old boat shop, half the fleet of mugs he'd had printed the year he opened and never reordered. Hers was robin's egg blue, delicate, clearly the orphaned survivor of some China set whose saucer had been lost or broken decades before I ever saw it. "Where's the rest of that set?" I asked her once, turning the little blue mug in my hands. "Gone," she said. "This is the only piece that made it." "Made it through what?" She looked at me for a second like she was deciding how much of the sentence to hand over. "A move," she said finally, which I understood, even then, to be true, and also not the whole truth, facts arranged carefully around a shape she wasn't ready to show me yet. I let it go. 14 months of practice. What I didn't let go of was noticing the wristband she wore every single day, rehearsal or not, a strip of worn brown leather with a small cushion sewn onto the top of it, bristling permanently with 3 sewing needles and a scatter of straight pins. My grandmother's? She told me, the first time I asked, holding her wrist up so I could see it properly. She ran the costume shop before there was a Grange playhouse to have one. Used to sew for the Ashwood Harbor Ladies Auxiliary out of her kitchen. She wore this same pincushion for 40 years. When she died, my mother wore it. Then I did. It's not sentimental, she added quickly, like sentiment was a debt she didn't want to be caught owing. It's practical. Saves reaching for a pin dish. Sure, I said. Practical. Don't do that. Do what? That thing where you agree with me but your face says something else. Your face has never once in its life said nothing. Silas Kane. That got the first real laugh out of me in longer than I could remember, and something in her expression eased when it landed, like she'd been testing whether she could still make somebody laugh on purpose instead of by accident, and had passed. We ran lines like that most nights for 2 weeks straight, and I learned Bobby Linecuvis the way you learn a good engine, by paying attention to the small sounds it makes when nobody's listening for them. She hummed under her breath when she was pinning a hem she was proud of. 3 notes. Always the same 3 notes, though she denied it flatly when I pointed it out. She ate exactly half a granola bar at the 10 o'clock break, every night, and put the other half back in the wrapper for tomorrow, the most disciplined or the saddest habit I'd ever watched a person keep, and possibly both. "You're doing the thing again," she said one night, not looking up. "Watching me like I'm a puzzle you're deciding whether to solve. I fix things for a living, Bobby. Watching is most of the job." "I'm not a bilge pump, Silas." "No," I agreed. "Bilge pumps are simpler." She threw a spool of thread at me for that, and missed on purpose, and something about the deliberate miss told me more than a direct hit would have. The costume shop itself became, over those 2 weeks, a place I could have drawn from memory with my eyes closed. 3 rolling racks, army surplus green, wheels that squealed at different pitches so you could tell which one Bobby was moving without looking up. A dress form in the corner she called Gladys, dressed permanently in whatever half-finished garment was currently under construction. A hand-lettered sign taped above the sewing machine that read, "Measure twice, judge never," which she'd stitched herself sometime in the 90s and refused to explain the second half of, though I had my suspicions even then. She talked while she worked, when she talked at all, in a low, unhurried register that made the cramped little room feel warmer than Gerald the furnace ever actually managed. She told me, carefully, about her ex-husband, a salesman named Kurt Hobart, who'd left for a woman in Grand Rapids 9 years back. His name said the way you'd name a brand of soap you no longer bought. I told her more about Renee than I'd told anyone, including Ray, because something about the mothballed dark and the hum of the hot plate made confession feel less like a wound reopening and more like handing somebody a tool they'd asked to borrow. "You still haven't taken the coat down," she said one night, not a question, when I mentioned the hook by my door without quite meaning to. "No." "Why not?" "I don't know yet," I told her, which was, at the time, the truest answer I had. She didn't push it. She just nodded, once, and threaded her needle again, and let the quiet do the rest of the talking that night, which I was starting to understand was, from Bobby Linecuvis, its own particular form of tenderness. By the first week of December, half the cast still didn't have costumes, because the church rummage donations had come up short on anything resembling 1890s formal wear, and the budget Gerald Pruitt had approved amounted to whatever change was left in the Grange's coffee fund after the fish fry. Bobby found a lead, a community theater 2 towns over, in Fenimore, that was shuttering after 40 years and giving away its costume stock rather than storing it. First come, first served, this coming Saturday only. It was raining that whole week, the kind of steady gray Michigan rain that turns the lake the color of a nickel, and nobody else from the cast was willing to drive 2 towns over in it for someone else's cast-off costumes. I offered to drive. She said she didn't need a chauffeur. I said I hadn't offered to be one. I'd offered to help carry boxes, which was different, and she considered that distinction seriously enough that I understood she'd actually weighed it, and finally said fine. But I was driving my own truck separately in case I turned out to be insufferable for 2 hours. I wasn't insufferable, or if I was, she didn't say so. We drove to Fenimore in the rain with the wipers going and the radio low, and I told her about my father's boat shop, how he used to say a motor that wouldn't turn over just needed somebody patient enough to find out what it was actually asking for. She went quiet for a second and said that was either the wisest or the corniest thing she'd heard all month. The Fenimore Theater's lobby still had its old popcorn machine sitting dark and unplugged by the door. The shuddering theater was a sad, beautiful place, dust motes hanging gold in slants of gray window light, and Bobby moved through it like a woman walking through a museum of a life she recognized. She ran her hand along a rack of 1950s taffeta gowns, pulled one out, pale green, with a sweetheart neckline, and held it up against herself in a cracked, full-length mirror propped against the wall. For just a second, before she caught herself, I watched her face do something unguarded, something almost young. "You should try it on," I said. "It's for whoever plays the mayor's wife in Act 3. Try it on anyway." She looked at me in the mirror for a long moment, then set it back on the rack instead. Careful, precise, done. "Some things fit better as costumes than as anything real," she said, and I didn't understand what she meant by that yet, though I'd think about that sentence again in a few weeks and understand it completely. Before we loaded anything, we spent the better part of an hour just going rack to rack, because the theater's manager, an exhausted, kind man named Otto, who'd run the place alone for its last 6 years, told us to take whatever we wanted before the estate liquidators came through Monday. Bobby moved through those racks like a woman reading a language nobody else in the building could still speak. She'd pull a jacket out, run her thumb along a seam, mutter "hand finished," "someone cared," or "machine," "rushed," "opening night emergency" without needing to check a label. She found a box of gloves sorted by size that she made a small, delighted sound over, quickly suppressed, like she'd caught herself enjoying something too openly. "This is the good part," she admitted, when I caught her at it. "Everyone thinks costuming is glue guns and safety pins. Nobody tells you it's also this. Walking into a dead theater and getting to decide what gets to live on somewhere else. Is that what you think you do? Decide what gets to live on?" She considered that longer than the question probably warranted, holding a moth-eaten velvet cloak up to the gray window light. "I suppose I've never put it that plainly before," she said. But yes, we loaded 4 boxes of costumes into both trucks in the rain, soaked through by the time we finished, laughing about it despite ourselves. She'd slipped on the wet gravel of Otto's lot and I'd caught her elbow before she went down, and neither of us mentioned how long my hand stayed there after she'd found her footing again. Otto waved us off from his doorway, looking like a man watching his own eulogy get packed into cardboard, and Bobby told me on the drive that he'd given her her first costuming job at 19, unpaid, sweeping thread off a floor that wasn't so different from the one she still swept now. On the drive back, she fell asleep against the window somewhere past the county line, rain drumming steady on the roof, her breathing gone slow and even in a way I'd never once seen her allow herself in public. I drove 20 under the speed limit the whole way so I wouldn't have to wake her, and I thought, with the particular ache of a man who'd promised himself he wasn't doing this again, that I could get used to a lot of years of driving this woman home in the rain. Opening night of a harbor Christmas fell on the second Friday of December. Coats piled 3 deep in the lobby. The fish fry flyer finally taken down and replaced with a poster Bobby had designed herself, though the program credited the board. I stood in the wings in Henry Abbott's wool coat with my heart going like a bad starter motor, and Bobby found me there in the dark and pressed something small and warm into my hand, a flask cap full of the same cocoa from the hot plate, which was not remotely professional and which I drank anyway in one swallow. 200 people out there, I said. 194, she said. I counted coats. But it's true, and true is what I've got. Then the house lights dropped, and she squeezed my arm once. Quick, businesslike, and was gone to call the show from the booth. I walked out under the lights and said Henry Abbott's first line to a dark room, the way I'd said it to an empty living room 40 times that fall, and it landed, and the room laughed in the places the script wanted it to laugh. Somewhere in Act 2, reciting a letter that did, in fact, rhyme in places, I looked into the wings and saw Bobby Linecuvist watching from the shadow of the curtain rope with an expression I hadn't earned yet and didn't fully understand until much later, the look of a woman watching something she'd built with her own hands finally get seen for what it was. We took our bows to real applause, and Dale Ferris, of all people, found me afterward by the coffee urn where this whole thing had started and shook my hand like he meant it. "I really did mean it as a joke," he admitted, a little sheepish. "I know. Didn't expect it to turn out to be the truest thing anybody's said about her in 10 years. "Neither did I said, and looked across the lobby to where Bobby stood, surrounded by well-wishers who were, for the first time in a decade, thanking her by name instead of thanking Gerald Pruitt. She caught my eye and rolled hers, just slightly, the private kind of eye roll that meant, "Can you believe these people?" It was 2 days after that performance that I found out the truth, And I found it out by accident, the way most true things about Bobby Linekuvist got found out, because she'd never once in 10 years planned to hand them over. I'd come backstage early for a Thursday rehearsal to return a costume box, and the door to the little dressing alcove behind the racks was half open, and Bobby was sitting on the low bench with her rehearsal skirt hiked to the knee, unbuckling something from around her ankle. A brace, gray, medical, the kind with a hinge and a strap system, worn soft and shiny at the edges from 20 years of use. The kind of thing you only wear that long if you've stopped hoping it's temporary. She looked up and saw me and went perfectly, dangerously still. "It's not what you," she started, then stopped, because we both knew it was exactly what it looked like, and she was too precise a woman to waste a sentence pretending otherwise. I could have backed out, to give her the dignity of not having been caught. But I'd learned enough of her by then to know that leaving would read to her as flinching, so I stayed in the doorway, quiet, and let her decide what happened next. What happened next was that Bobby Linekuvist put her face in her hands for 1 second, and then took it away and looked at me with something that had finally run out of places to hide. "I was 22, she said, and I had a callback for a Broadway ensemble. Real Broadway, Silas. An actual show, an actual stage, my name on an actual callback list with people whose names you'd know. Callback week. 6 of us left for 4 spots. And on the second night of callbacks, I came down off a riser wrong. Nothing dramatic, just a wrong step on a riser I'd walked 100 times that week, and I shattered my ankle in 4 places. Bobby. I let them believe I didn't have it, she said, over me, like she needed to get the whole thing out now that the door was finally open. Everyone in Ashwood Harbor. When I came home from New York with a limp and a brace and no Broadway, it was so much easier to let them assume I just hadn't had the talent for it. Because the truth, an accident, bad luck, 20 years of a brace under every costume I've ever sewn myself into, the truth felt like it needed comforting. And I have never, she said, and her voice cracked exactly once, on that word, never once in my life wanted to be comforted. Being pitied for bad luck felt so much worse than being underestimated for no talent. I crossed the small room and sat down on the bench beside her, not touching her, just close enough that she'd know I wasn't going anywhere. 12 years of innkeepers' wives, I said quietly, because the innkeeper's wife doesn't dance. She looked at me, and something in her face broke open just slightly, surprised that I'd landed on the exact shape of it without her having to draw the whole picture. The innkeeper's wife doesn't dance, she agreed. The innkeeper's wife stands very still by a fireplace and says wise things about hospitality. I have been extremely good at standing very still by a fireplace for 12 years, Silas. You're better than that. I know what I'm better than, she said, sharp for a second, protecting something. Then, softer, I just don't know what to do with people finding out. I'm not people, I said. You don't have to arrange anything for me. She looked at me a long moment and didn't buckle the brace back on right away and let me see it a little longer than she needed to, which from Bobby Linekuvist I understood to be its own kind of trust, quiet, and enormous. Does anyone else know? I asked. My mother knew. She's been gone 6 years. My sister in Traverse City knows, because she was there when it happened, 22 years old herself, and drove 12 hours straight through the night to sit with me in that hospital. Nobody in this town knows. Not Priya, not Dale, not Gerald. She said it without much heat, a fact more than a complaint. I've had 20 years of practice being the woman who just wasn't good enough for the big stage. It's a comfortable coat. It fits. How do they look at you? I asked. Like I'm a nice, sad, minor chord. Something to be kind to. I have never once, in 20 years, wanted to be somebody's kind minor chord, Silas. Her jaw set, and for a moment the woman I'd first seen at the bulletin board was back, spine straight, giving nothing away. The other story lets people underestimate me without pitying me. I could survive being underestimated. I was never sure I could survive being pitied, so I picked the story that let me keep my spine. I thought about that for a while, the two of us sitting on that narrow bench in a room that smelled like mothballs and hairspray. That's a lonely math to be doing for 20 years, I said finally. It's the only math I had, she said. Nobody handed me a better equation. I didn't say anything clever back to that, because there wasn't anything clever to say. So I just sat with her until she was ready to buckle the brace back on herself, unhurried, and stand up, and go back out to a rehearsal where nobody but the two of us would know that anything in the building had changed. That was the hinge the whole rest of the story turned on, though I wouldn't understand until later just how much weight was sitting on it. 2 weeks after that, Bobby started pulling away, and I didn't understand why, and it scared me in a very specific, very old way. It started small. She gave 2 of her blocking notes to Priya instead of delivering them herself, which she'd never done before. She stopped staying late among the costume racks, started leaving before the cocoa was even hot. When I asked her, straightforward, what was going on, she said she had an equipment order trip coming up, a costume supplier in Chicago, 3 days, maybe 4, nothing worth discussing. I believed her for about a week. Then I stopped, because I'd spent 33 years learning to read machines that lied to you about what was actually wrong with them, and Bobby Linecuvist had started rattling in a way that had nothing to do with fabric swatches. The cocoa stopped first. That was the detail that told me, more than anything she said, that something underneath had shifted. 3 weeks of a hot plate humming behind the costume rack, 2 mismatched mugs, and then one Tuesday the hot plate stayed cold and unplugged, and she told me she'd been meaning to cut back on sugar anyway, which was the kind of sentence a person only reaches for when the truth is too large to hand over, honestly. I drank my coffee from a paper cup that night instead, standing near the racks like a man loitering outside a house he used to be welcome in, and told myself it didn't mean what it felt like it meant. It meant exactly what it felt like it meant. Chicago, I said to her one night backstage, my chipped anchor mug going cold in my hands. That's where Renee went. Her hands stilled over the sewing machine. I know where your fiancé went, Silas. I've known for weeks. This isn't that, isn't it? You're pulling out of the play you've run for a decade for a mysterious trip to the exact city that took the last woman I loved, and you won't tell me what it's for. It's fabric. It's not fabric. My voice came out harder than I meant it to, and I hated the sound of it. Hated that it sounded exactly like a man bracing for the same door to close twice. Something's wrong and you're doing the flat, filed, easier story thing, and I would rather you just tell me the truth than watch you quietly disappear 4 minutes at a time until you're gone. She turned from the machine to look at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, Roberta Linecuvist looked frightened. Not of me, of the sentence she hadn't said yet. It's the ankle, she said finally, quiet. There's a surgeon in Chicago. A reconstruction, tendon, and joint work. It wasn't even possible when I was young enough for anyone to have offered it to me. My doctor here has been pushing me toward a consult for 2 years, and I kept saying no. I finally said yes. The consult's in 10 days. If they take the case, it's surgery, and it's months, Silas. Not 4 days. Months of rehab in the city, because the recovery protocol needs to be near the surgical team. I wasn't going to tell you until I knew for certain it was happening, because... She stopped. Because I'd hear months in Chicago and think it was Renee all over again. Yes, she admitted. And because if you looked at me like I was about to become the second woman who left you for that city, I didn't know if I could go through with something I've wanted for 20 years. I stood there with my cold cocoa and the whole shape of it finally visible. And I understood that I had a choice about what kind of man I was going to be in the next 30 seconds. The same choice I'd had at that bulletin board in November, and I very nearly got it wrong. I could feel the old fear reaching up, the specific fear of watching someone I loved choose a city over a life with me, and it wanted very badly to turn into an argument. I didn't let it. Not that night. I wish I could tell you I got it right the very first try. But the truth is, I said something clipped about her not trusting me enough to say it sooner, and she said something sharp back about not owing me her whole diagnosis on my schedule, and we left it there, unfinished, both of us a little bruised, and she pulled further away over the following days instead of closer. The play had closed its short run by then, but the cast still gathered Thursdays to strike the set and box the costumes for storage, and I watched Bobby do to herself, in the space of a week, exactly what she'd spent 12 years training the whole town to do to her without noticing. She stopped wearing the pincushion to strike nights. She let Priya take the last 2 supply order calls that should have been hers, and started saying, "We'll see," instead of making the decisions she'd made without asking anyone's permission for a decade. Each small abdication looked, from the outside, like humility, and felt, from where I stood, like watching a woman quietly practice being gone before she'd even left. I tried, that week, to do the things that had worked before. I brought the cocoa hot plate back out myself one night, plugged it in without asking, poured 2 mugs, and set hers down next to her sewing without a word. She looked at it a long moment, robin's egg blue steaming faintly in the cold backstage air. Instead, she said, quietly, "Not tonight, Silas," and didn't touch it. And I drank both mugs myself that night, alone among the racks, telling myself it was practical, and knowing it wasn't really about the cocoa at all. I noticed, too, the way she'd started double-checking things she used to simply know. Asking Priya to confirm a blocking note she'd invented herself, asking me twice in one evening whether the truck had enough gas for Fenimore, small, unnecessary confirmations from a woman suddenly discovering she couldn't trust her own footing. I wanted to tell her I saw it happening. I didn't, yet, which is its own kind of cowardice, dressed up as patience. I tried once more before the alley, clumsily, over the hot plate that had gone cold between us. I asked her straight out if she was scared of the surgery or scared of me, and she said, with the particular precision she used when a question had actually landed somewhere tender, "I don't know yet which one I'm more practiced at surviving," and wouldn't say another word about it that night, which is how I knew we weren't done, only postponed. The honest conversation, the one that actually mattered, happened 8 days later, at the stage door, in the rain. It was the Thursday before her consult, and rehearsal had run late and ugly. Bobby distracted, missing blocking, she'd invented herself, snapping at Priya over nothing. She left before notes were finished, out through the fire exit into the alley behind the Grange, and I went after her because I was done letting fear write both our lines for us. She was standing just outside the door under the little fire exit light, rain coming down steady behind her, arms crossed against the cold, and when she heard the door, she didn't turn around right away. "I know why you're upset," she said to the rain. "You think I'm doing what she did. I don't think that anymore," I said. "I did, for about 4 days. I'm not proud of it," she turned then. The fire exit bulb threw everything half orange, half shadow, rain falling gold and black in the light of it, and she looked, for the first time since I'd met her, entirely unarmored, not dry, not precise, not filed flat, just a woman standing in the rain with 20 years of a secret finally out of her hands. "I don't know how to be wanted," she said. Her voice had gone small in a way I'd never heard from her. "I know how to be useful. Useful doesn't ask anybody to stay. I don't know what to do with a man who wants me to go get the surgery I've needed for 20 years and still wants to be standing here when I get back. I don't have a filed flat sentence for that. I've never needed one before." I stepped out into the rain with her, close enough that the fire exit light caught us both. "Then let me say it plain, since you don't have practice hearing it," I said. Go get your ankle fixed. Go dance again, if that's still in there somewhere, under 12 years of standing still by a fireplace. I am not the reason you should stay small, Bobby. I've spent 14 months mistaking fear for wisdom, and I'm not going to let it cost you this. Go to Chicago. Have the surgery. Take the months. I want you here when it's done, brace or no brace, city trip and all, and if that's not something you know how to trust yet, I'm not asking you to trust it tonight. I'm asking you to let me still be standing here when you're ready to. She was crying, quietly, the rain doing most of the work of hiding it. You don't know that you'll still want this in 6 months. No, I agreed. But I know I want it tonight, and I intend to keep wanting it tomorrow, on purpose, the way I fix things. That's the only kind of certain a person actually gets, Bobby. The kind you choose again every morning. She looked at me a long moment, rain soaking both of us through, and then she did something I hadn't expected. She reached up and unbuckled the leather wristband with her grandmother's pincushion on it, the one she'd worn every day of the 10 weeks I'd known her, and held it out to me. "Keep this for me," she said, "while I'm gone. I don't want to lose it in a hospital, and I don't want to leave it home where I won't see it. I want it somewhere I know it's safe." I took it from her like she was handing me something considerably heavier than leather and 3 sewing pins, because I understood exactly what she was actually handing me. "I'll keep it safe," I said. "That's why I'm giving it to you." Then she stepped in and kissed me once, careful, brief, rain running down both our faces, and when she pulled back, she was almost laughing through what was left of the tears. "That furnace still rattles," she said, apropos of nothing, which is exactly the kind of thing Bobby Lynchkovist says when she's too full to say anything bigger. "I'll fix it while you're gone," I told her. Properly, this time. Not patched. "See that you do," she said, and went back inside to finish her notes, dry-eyed by the time she reached the stage, because that was Bobby. She could come apart completely in an alley and reassemble herself by the time she crossed a threshold, and I loved her, standing there in the rain, entirely and without reservation, for exactly that. The consult became a surgery date. The surgery became 4 months in Chicago, longer than either of us had braced for, complications with the graft that meant a second procedure in month 2, and those 4 months were not easy. There were nights I lay awake with the old fear circling. But I had made a decision in that alley, and I kept making it every morning the way I'd promised her I would. We talked most nights, 10 minutes, sometimes less, because rehab left her wrung out in a way she was too proud to describe directly. She'd tell me instead in details. A physical therapist named Curtis, who made her count reps out loud like she was in grade school. A pigeon that had built, outside her sublet window, what she called an architecturally offensive nest. I told her about the marina, about the furnace, about how Gerald Pruitt had tried to take credit for the opening night ticket sales and how Priya had, very politely, corrected the record. "You're defending my honor from a distance," Bobby said once, dry even through bad cell reception. "That's either very sweet or slightly unhinged." "Both," I said. "I contain multitudes." Don't steal lines from other people's love stories. Silas. There was a stretch in late January, after the second procedure, when the calls thinned to almost nothing. And that was the week the old fear got the loudest it had ever gotten, whispering that this was exactly how it had started with Renee, too. I nearly drove to Chicago unannounced before I caught myself and did something harder instead, which was wait and trust the decision I'd made in the alley. When she finally called, her voice was thin and apologetic. The second procedure had hurt worse than the first, and she'd been too proud to let me hear her sound that low. I told her I'd rather hear her sound low than not hear her at all, and she was quiet for a second, and then said, "I'm learning," which from Bobby Linekuvist was as close to a vow as a phone call gets. I mailed her the pincushion halfway through. When she said over the phone, small and tired, that she missed having it on her wrist, even though she couldn't sew a stitch with her leg elevated. She called the day it arrived and said only that she'd worn it to physical therapy that afternoon. Useless for sewing, entirely useful for the other thing. And Curtis had asked what it was, and she'd told him the whole story, out loud, to a stranger, for the first time in 20 years, and hadn't hated how it felt. I fixed the furnace. Really fixed it. Replaced the whole exhaust assembly over 3 cold weekends, so that by February the Grange Playhouse ran warm for the first time in anyone's memory, and the cast kept calling the new, silent, perfectly functioning furnace Gerald anyway, because some jokes outlive their reasons. I kept her mug on my windowsill next to mine, and every night I made cocoa in both of them, and drank hers too, because some nights that was the closest thing to praying I did. She came home in June, 7 months after that bulletin board, and I met her at the Fenimore bus stop because Ashwood Harbor didn't rate its own station, and when she stepped down off that bus she was walking. Not limping, not favoring the leg the way I'd watched her do. Quietly, invisibly, every day for 10 weeks before I'd even known there was a brace to favor around. Walking, plain and unremarkable and entirely extraordinary. 20 years of a fireplace finally behind her. 20 years, she said, when she caught me staring at her feet like an idiot. I forgot what my own ankle feels like without something strapped to it. I've been walking around Chicago for a week just to feel it. How does it feel? She considered the question with the seriousness she gave everything. Light, she said finally. Like I've been carrying a bag of nails for 20 years and just noticed I could put it down. There is a particular way a person walks when they've been carrying something invisible for 20 years and just set it down. A looseness in the hip, a length to the stride, and I watched Bobby Linekuvist walk that way toward me. She had a small duffel bag over one shoulder, and she looked thinner than when she'd left, tired in a new way. The good kind that comes from actually doing the hard thing. When I finally hugged her, careful, like she might still be made of something breakable, she laughed against my shoulder and said, "You can hug me like a normal person, Silas." I had ankle surgery, not a full-body transplant, and I laughed too, and held her a little less carefully after that. She smelled different, faintly, some Chicago detergent instead of the mothball and hairspray smell I'd come to think of as hers, and she looked, standing there in the ordinary daylight of that parking lot, both entirely like herself and like a woman I was meeting for a second time. "You're staring," she said, not unkindly. "I haven't seen you in 4 months. You saw me on a phone screen every few nights." "That's not seeing you. That's seeing a photograph of you complain about a pigeon." I reached for her duffel bag, and she let me take it, which from Bobby Linekuvist was its own small surrender. "Seeing you is different. Seeing you is this." She didn't have a dry comeback ready for that, and we stood there another moment in the ordinary June sun, both of us understanding that ordinary was the whole point. She noticed the truck before anything else, my same battered Ford with the passenger door that stuck in cold weather, and ran her hand along the hood like she was greeting an old friend she hadn't expected to miss. "You kept the ugly truck," she said. "You kept your sense of humor about my truck." "I missed this truck," she admitted, climbing in, and then, quieter, looking at the dashboard where I'd taped a photograph from opening night. "I missed a lot of things I didn't let myself miss out loud. It felt safer not to. And now? Now I'm apparently the kind of woman who cries at a Ford truck," she said, wiping one eye with the back of her wrist, the wrist that still had nothing tied to it, because the pincushion was waiting for her at home on my windowsill beside 2 mugs. "Don't tell anyone. Your secret's safe. I've kept bigger ones." She looked at me sideways, dry again already, some of the old armor sliding back into place out of habit. "Don't get smug about the pincushion, Silas Kane. It was a loan, not a proposal." "Give it time," I said, and she laughed the whole way back to Ashwood Harbor, the lake gray and enormous out the window, home in every direction that mattered. I married Roberta Leinquist the following spring, on the same stage where a harbor Christmas had run for one short week, because neither of us could imagine getting married anywhere that didn't smell faintly of sawdust and old velvet curtain. Aunt Dot did the flowers. Gerald Pruitt gave a toast in which he somehow implied he'd introduced us personally, and Bobby caught my eye with an expression of such perfect, private amusement that I nearly laughed out loud at my own wedding. At the reception, on the same stage where a joke cast list had once made a whole town laugh at the wrong thing, I asked my wife to dance. The band was just old Frank Dunmore with his accordion, but he played something slow, and Bobby Lindqvist stepped into my arms, her grandmother's pincushion pinned, for once, not to a wristband, but to the inside seam of her wedding dress where only she and I would ever know it was there, and we danced. No brace, no favoring a step, just a woman dancing, plainly, for the first time in 20 years, on the same boards where she'd spent 12 of them standing very still by a fireplace so nobody would notice what she couldn't do. "Everyone's watching," she murmured against my shoulder. "Let them. I've spent my whole life not wanting to be watched like this, watched and pitied." "Nobody's pitying you," I said. "Look at their faces if you don't believe me." She looked, just briefly, over my shoulder at a room full of people who had spent a decade thinking of her as wardrobe and an innkeeper's wife, watching her dance without a brace for the first time, and whatever she saw in their faces made her exhale something that had been held a very long time. "Well," she said, settling back against me, dry as ever even now, "I suppose Dale Ferris's joke turned out better than he had any right to expect." "Don't tell him that. He'll never let it go." "I'm telling everyone that," she said. "I've decided I'm allowed to enjoy the story now that I know how it ends." 2 mismatched mugs sit on our windowsill to this day, an anchor and a robin's egg blue, and most nights I make cocoa in both of them, and Bobby Leinquist, who runs the Grange Playhouse now under her own name, because the year she came back from Chicago walking on her own 2 feet was the same year the board finally made her title match her decade of work, takes hers without a word of thanks, because we stopped needing the words for that a long time ago. Some things you just say by pouring the second mug. What would you have done if a joke pairing on a cast list turned out to be the truest thing anyone ever said about you? Have you ever watched someone you love finally stop hiding the thing that hurt them? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.